For 2 years, Josephine wrote love letters to a duke. Every word was hers, every feeling was real. He just didn't know her name. He believed he was falling in love with Josephine's cousin. He wasn't, and she let it continue, because those pages were the only place in her life where she was completely herself, where someone actually heard her. Then she made the only decision she had left. She married another man. On the morning of the wedding, the Duke was sitting in the third pew, with one of her letters folded inside his coat pocket. Not her cousin's letter, hers. He didn't yet know what it meant. But when the vows were spoken, when the ring was placed on the wrong finger, he would find out, and nothing would ever be the same. This is the story of 34 letters, a borrowed name, and a man who recognized her anyway. Subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Let's begin. The church smelled of beeswax and lilies. Josephine Calloway stood at the threshold of St. Edmund's Chapel, her gloved fingers wrapped tight around a bouquet of white roses. Roses she had not chosen for a wedding she had not dreamed of, beside a man whose name she had rehearsed in the mirror every morning for the past 3 weeks, without ever once feeling it land in her chest the way it was supposed to. Lord Edmund Pemberton was a good man. She knew this. Everyone knew this. He was kind in the way that well-bred men are trained to be kind. Measured, appropriate, never too warm and never too cold. He had offered her family salvation when salvation had no other face. And Josephine, daughter of a baron whose estates had crumbled quietly under decades of mismanagement and one devastating winter, had accepted his proposal with a curtsy, a soft smile, and a heart that had already been given away to someone who did not know her name. He is here. The thought arrived before she was ready for it. She had promised herself she would not look, but her eyes moved, slowly, past the rows of silk bonnets and powdered shoulders, past the flicker of candlelight on stone columns, until they found him, Gregory Ashford, the Duke of Ashford. He sat in the third pew from the front on the left side, in a coat the color of midnight. His jaw was set. His hands rested on his knees, with the deliberate stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself like armor. Josephine's fingers tightened around the bouquet stems. She looked away. The organ began its slow ceremonial ascent, and the guests rose in a rustle of mourning coats and fine muslin, and Josephine Calloway took the first step down the aisle and thought, with devastating clarity, "He is going to watch me marry someone else. And he will never know that every word he ever loved was mine." It had begun 2 years ago, in a different kind of desperation, not hers at first, her cousin's. Arabella Whitmore was everything Josephine was not, fair where Josephine was dark, effortless where Josephine was careful, beloved in every ballroom she entered, while Josephine stood at the edge of them, listening, watching, turning observations into sentences in the privacy of her own mind. Arabella had the kind of beauty that made people assume she had nothing else. She was not cruel, she was simply elsewhere. And Arabella had a problem. The Duke of Ashford, her family's long-standing social connection, had written to her, a formal letter on the surface. But between the lines of polished courtesy lived something Arabella recognized as expectation. Her mother had replied too eagerly, suggesting an exchange of correspondence while the Duke remained at his northern estate. Arabella had panicked. "I cannot write to him, Joe," she had whispered one evening, her voice frantic over the embroidery neither of them was actually doing. "You know I cannot. My letters read like shopping lists. He will think me an absolute—" "Do not ask me," Josephine had said. Already knowing she would say yes, she had said yes. The first letter had been an exercise in careful performance. Josephine wrote it in Arabella's voice as she imagined it, light, pleasant, unburdened. She asked the Duke about his northern estate, about whether he preferred the quiet of the countryside to the noise of London, about what he found worth preserving in a world that seemed constantly bent on discarding things. It was, she thought, a perfectly reasonable letter from a perfectly reasonable young woman. His reply arrived 11 days later. She had not expected it to be so present, so unexpectedly without the varnish she associated with men of his standing. He had written about the quiet of Ashford Park with something that lived just beneath the surface of his words. Not quite longing, not quite grief, but something that moved between the two. He had answered her question about preservation with a single paragraph that made her sit very still at her writing desk for a long time afterward. "I believe we preserve what we fear losing most, Miss Whitmore." which means the truest inventory of a man's heart is not found in what he keeps, but in what he is afraid to name. Josephine read it 3 times. She pressed her hand flat against the paper, felt the warmth of ink that had dried in another person's study, in another county. He is not what anyone says he is. The second letter came harder, not because she lacked words, she never lacked words, but because the words that rose naturally in her were her own, not Arabella's. And yet she wrote them. She wrote about the particular cruelty of social obligation, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who see only your surface, about the strange comfort of a good book on a grey morning when the world outside demands nothing. She wrote, "Do you ever feel, Your Grace, that you are performing a version of yourself that satisfies everyone's expectations and yet is somehow entirely exhausting to maintain?" She stared at that line, then folded the letter and sealed it before she could take it back. His reply came in 7 days. "Miss Whitmore, every single day of my adult life." That was all. But it was enough. It was the kind of answer that arrives already complete, already landing exactly where it was aimed. Josephine understood then that she was in trouble. The months that followed had a quality she would later struggle to name. By the 6th month, she had stopped trying to write in Arabella's voice entirely. She was not sure when the shift had happened. It had been gradual, worn away by the tide of Gregory's responses. He wrote with such specificity, with such careful attention to exactly what she had said, that maintaining a false register became impossible. He would reference a phrase she used 3 letters ago. He would return to a question she raised and answer it from a new angle, as though he had been thinking about it in the interval. He was the kind of man who listened, truly listened. She had fallen somewhere between the 19th and 23rd letter. She could not identify the exact moment. She only knew that one morning she had sat down to write and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was not writing for Arabella anymore. She had not been writing for Arabella for a long time. She was writing because it was the closest she had ever come to being known. By the time the engagement between Lord Pemberton and Josephine was announced, she had written 31 letters. She had stopped after the announcement. She had seen Gregory twice in the 9 months since. Once at a dinner where he stood by the fireplace and did not look in her direction, and once at a garden party in late summer where she had turned a corner between 2 hedgerows and very nearly walked directly into him. He had caught her by the arm. A reflex. His hand on her forearm, through the thin fabric of her sleeve, had lasted 4 seconds. She had counted. His eyes moved to her face with the quick assessing quality of a man determining threats. She met his gaze and felt, with devastating precision, the exact distance between who she was to him, a stranger, and who he was to her. "Forgive me," he said, releasing her arm. "Not at all, Your Grace," she replied. He nodded and walked on. She stayed in the gap between the hedgerows a moment longer, her arm still warm where his hand had been, and thought, "He has no idea. He will never have any idea." And that is as it should be. She had believed that then. Standing at the aisle now, she believed it a little less. She could feel him, not in any mystical sense, but in the particular awareness that comes from 2 years of intimate knowledge of a person's interior life. She knew how he held tension in his jaw. She knew that he pressed his thumb against his ring finger when he was suppressing something. She could see from this distance that he was doing it now. She told herself it did not matter. The organs swelled. Her father's hand appeared at her elbow, her father diminished and apologetic in his morning coat, grateful in the way of men who know they are being rescued. She covered his hand with hers. She straightened her spine. She began to walk. And in the 3rd pew on the left, in a coat the colour of midnight, the Duke of Ashford turned his head, just slightly, just enough, and watched her come down the aisle toward another man. His expression did not change, but his thumb pressed hard against his ring finger. And on the floor beside his boot, half tucked beneath the pew in front of him, lay a single folded letter, the paper slightly worn at the creases from having been opened and closed many times, in the handwriting of a woman he had never met and missed. With an intensity he had never once allowed himself to name. He had found it last night. He did not yet know what it meant, but he would. The letter had arrived by mistake. That was the detail Gregory Ashford could not reconcile, the thread he kept pulling at in the hours between finding it and sitting now in the cold stone quiet of St. Edmund's Chapel, watching a woman he did not know walk toward an altar. It had come tucked inside a parcel of Arabella Whitmore's correspondence, returned to him after her family decided the matter ought to be tidily concluded. His secretary had left it on the desk in the study without remark. Gregory opened it expecting nothing. The letters had been in a bundle tied with pale blue ribbon. He had not read them again. He had not needed to. He knew them. He had read every one of them so many times that certain phrases had settled into the architecture of his thinking, appearing unbidden when he was riding or standing at a window, or sitting through the particular tedium of a parliamentary dinner. Do you ever feel, Your Grace, that you are performing a version of yourself that satisfies everyone's expectations, and yet is somehow entirely exhausting to maintain? He had been performing a version of himself for so long that the question arrived like a key fitting a lock he had forgotten existed. But the final letter, tucked not with the bundle but separately, folded inside the outer wrapping of the parcel itself, was not the same as the others. It was not addressed to him. The handwriting was identical. The same flowing, precise script he had come to know across 31 letters. The same particular way the writer formed their L's with a slight forward lean. The same unhurried pressure of someone who thought before they wrote, but the salutation read, "Dear no one in particular." He stopped reading after the first page, not because it was dull. He stopped because the sensation of reading it had been so disorienting, so profoundly unlike anything he had experienced in his 31 years, that he needed to put it down and stand very still and simply breathe. He picked it up again 20 minutes later. He read it through to the end. He sat in the chair by the fire for a long time afterward, the letter resting on the arm of it, the fire burning down to orange coals. He thought about a woman who had written to him for nearly 2 years, who had asked the questions no one else thought to ask, who had matched his thought with her own thought and raised it, letter by letter, into something he had never expected to find in a correspondence arranged for someone else's purposes. A woman who was not Arabella Whitmore. She stopped writing 9 months ago. He had told himself at the time that he was not disappointed. He had written back twice after the letters ceased. The replies came from Arabella herself, brief, pleasant, recognizably empty. He understood that whatever the correspondence had been, it was concluded. He had not understood why it ended. He understood now. 9 months ago, a young woman became engaged to Lord Edmund Pemberton, and she had stopped writing to him. The ceremony proceeded with the inevitability of all formal things. Gregory sat through it with the surface of himself entirely composed, and the interior in a state of controlled disorder he had not experienced since the night his father died. Something was being concluded in front of him, something he had not known he cared about until the moment it became irretrievable. The vicar spoke. The congregation rose and sat with trained rhythm. Lord Pemberton stood at the altar with the air of a man who has won something and is careful not to look too pleased. And she stood beside him. Josephine, he had heard her name once, whispered by the woman beside him to her companion. He sat with the letter half pressed against his breast pocket and watched her from 3 rows back. It was the Whitmore family pew that gave him the beginning of an answer. Arabella sat with her mother 3 rows back, and her gaze tracked the woman at the aisle with a specific mixture of guilt and relief. The conscience of someone who has benefited from another person's sacrifice. He turned back to the aisle. Who are you? The question arrived with a force that was not polite. It was the question of a man who has been reading someone's innermost thoughts for 2 years and is now seeing for the first time the hands that wrote them. He had no evidence beyond a feeling and a piece of handwriting he had memorized without meaning to. But the letter, "Dear no one in particular," had been written by someone who described herself in one small devastating aside as a person constitutionally unsuited to belonging in rooms designed for her cousin's kind of beauty. And it was in the handwriting of a woman who had written 31 times to him. The vicar arrived at the portion of the ceremony where silence is invited before the words of binding are spoken. The few seconds offered to God and to conscience and to anyone who believes they have cause to speak. Gregory did not move. He was not certain. He was operating on instinct and handwriting and the particular ache of a man who has spent 2 years in conversation with someone and only now understood what those conversations were worth. He had no proof. He had no right. The silence stretched. He did not move. The vows were spoken. And Josephine Calloway became Lady Pemberton in the gold-lit quiet of St. Edmund's Chapel, while the Duke of Ashford sat 3 rows back and pressed his thumb against his finger and said nothing at all. The reception was held in the Pemberton townhouse on Cavendish Square. High ceilings, tall windows, the late afternoon light coming through in long warm columns that caught the crystal glasses and scattered small prisms across the white tablecloths. Gregory stood at the edge of it and held a glass of champagne he did not intend to drink. He watched her from across the room. She was composed. She spoke to guests with gracious attention, the surface of herself given freely while the rest stayed under careful guard. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She accepted congratulations with phrases that were warm and appropriate, and entirely without the specific texture of genuine expression. He knew that texture. He had read it for 2 years. This was not it. Lord Pemberton stood at her side for the first hour, then was absorbed by a conversation near the windows, and then she was alone in the particular way that is only possible in a crowded room, surrounded, attended to, and absolutely by herself. Gregory set down his champagne. His feet carried him across the room before the intention had fully formed, and then he was there within arm's reach of her, and she turned, sensing the approach the way one senses weather before it arrives, and looked at him. Her eyes were dark. He had not been close enough to see this at the chapel, dark and still and lit with something very carefully being held back. She blinked once. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low and precise, each word carrying a quality of measured weight, as though chosen with the same care she put to paper. "Lady Pemberton," he said. Something crossed her face. Not pain, exactly. Something quieter than pain, and more lasting. "Congratulations seem rather redundant when given by a stranger," she said. The line was light, social, but there was a second thing in it, buried underneath, and he felt it the way you feel a sound just below hearing. "We have not been formally introduced," he said. "No," she agreed, "we have not." They stood in the brief, strange pause that falls between two people when something unspoken is occupying all available space. Gregory reached into his breast pocket. He did not take the letter out. He simply rested his hand against it, against the folded paper that had kept him from sleeping, that had brought him across this room, and watched her eyes track the gesture. Her composure did not break, but her fingers tightened once around the stem of her champagne glass. One small white flower had come loose from her hair. It rested against the curve of her collarbone, pale against dark fabric, precarious, entirely unaware of itself. Gregory looked at it, then looked at her face. "I wonder, Lady Pemberton," he said, keeping his voice level, "whether you might indulge a stranger in a question." Her chin lifted slightly. "That would depend," she said, "on the question." "I have been corresponding," he said carefully, "with someone I have never met, for nearly 2 years. Someone who wrote to me with a particular quality of attention that I have not encountered elsewhere." He paused. "The correspondence ended 9 months ago, without explanation." She was absolutely still. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said. "The difficulty," Gregory said quietly, "is that I have recently come to suspect that the person I was corresponding with was not who I believed her to be." The champagne glass was very still in her hand. "How extraordinary," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Shall I tell you what I believe is most extraordinary about it?" She should have said no. The entire architecture of the situation demanded she excuse herself and return to her husband's side. She looked at him for a long moment. "Tell me," she said. "I believe," Gregory said, "that whoever she was the most honest person I have ever not known. And I find I am somewhat unwilling to let the matter rest there." The flower fell from her collarbone. Neither of them moved to retrieve it. The room continued around them, the crystal and the light and the conversations of people who did not know that something very quiet and very irreversible was happening near the east wall of the Pemberton drawing room. Josephine looked at him, and for the first time since she had walked down that aisle, she breathed. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the large bed in the large room and looked at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. The appointments were elegant and impersonal, beautiful objects chosen with no one specific in mind. She pressed her fingers against her sternum and stared upward and thought about a man who had said, "I find I am somewhat unwilling to let the matter rest there." She rose. The floorboards were cold through her stockings. She crossed to the window, pressed one hand against the glass and looked at the dark street below. The last lanterns, a lone carriage, the city breathing itself into quiet. Her breath fogged the glass in a slow circle. He knows. Not everything. He had a letter. She had understood that from the gesture, the hand against the breast pocket, the way his eyes watched her when he described the correspondent. He had read it and drawn a conclusion that was, she suspected, accurate. He knew the handwriting was the same. He knew the voice was the same. She turned from the window, sat at the edge of the bed, clasped her hands in her lap, and held them there. What he did not know, could not know from a single letter, from a single conversation, was the full weight of it. The 31 letters. The 9 months of silence. The specific shape of what she had spent 2 years building, letter by letter, in the luminous, terrible intimacy of a correspondence that had never been hers to have. She had loved the architecture of his thinking, the way he approached a question from 3 sides before committing to an answer. The occasional dry brevity of his humor, which arrived without announcement and disappeared again quickly, like sun through a cloud. The fact that he had told her in the careful language of a man not accustomed to disclosure, that he was exhausted by the performance of himself. She had loved that he trusted her with that. The window had gone fully dark with condensation. She wiped a small, clear circle in it with her palm and looked through it at nothing. He is not married. She was married. He was not. He was the Duke of Ashford, and he had held a letter in a chapel and watched her walk down an aisle and then found her in a crowded room and said the most careful, most devastating thing anyone had ever said to her in a room full of witnesses. She returned to the window, pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. She thought about honesty, the particular honesty she had given him across 31 letters, the honesty that was real and also a lie, because every word had been given to him under another name. She had been honest about everything except the most fundamental thing. She had told him the shape of her interior life with an intimacy she had never permitted in any actual relationship, while hiding behind a name that was not hers. Was that honesty? She suspected not. She suspected it was the most elaborate contradiction she had ever embodied, more herself in those letters than anywhere else in her life, and less herself at the same time. The morning came grey and damp. London apologizing for itself. Josephine rose before the household, sat at the writing desk near the window and looked at the street below. The early carts, the lamplighter doing his rounds in reverse, the particular emptiness of a city not yet awake. The writing desk was bare. She had not written anything in 9 months. Her stationery sat untouched at the corner of it. She set her hands flat on the surface. She did not write. Not yet. A knock. Clara, the young housemaid with the round face and efficient manner, entered with morning tea and a small silver tray on which sat a single card. "This was delivered this morning, milady. The man who brought it waited briefly, but when told you were not yet receiving, he said there was no reply required." Josephine looked at the card, her name on the outside in a script she recognized with the particular immediacy of someone who has spent 2 years waiting for exactly this handwriting. Clara left. Josephine sat with the card between her fingers for a moment. The weight of it was nothing. Paper, ink, folds, it weighed nothing at all. She turned it over. "Lady Pemberton, I find I owe you an apology. I read something I should not have read, and I cannot unknow what it told me. I will not act on that knowledge improperly. I want you to know that. But I would ask you to consider one thing. Whoever you were in those letters, whatever the circumstances that required the concealment, you were entirely and recognizably yourself. I am certain of it. I was certain of it before I suspected anything. I think you should know that you were known." Ashford Josephine set it face down on the desk. She pressed both palms flat against it. She breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old and had fallen from a horse and could not find enough air. You were known. She had written 31 letters to a man who thought she was someone else, and he had recognized her anyway. Not by name, not by face, by the way she thought, by the way she chose words, by the way she circled the things she was most afraid to name. She looked at the grey window. She picked up the pen. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not allow herself to examine it. She simply wrote, "Your Grace, you do not owe me an apology." The letter was not intended for anyone, which means it was intended in some sense for everyone. I would not correct your suspicion, though I am not yet prepared to confirm it. There are things I need to understand before I can speak plainly, and I would ask for a small period of time to understand them. What I can tell you with complete honesty, and perhaps the first uncomplicated honesty I have offered anyone in some time, is this. Those letters were mine. Every word. J. She folded it before she could reconsider, rang for Clara, said to have it delivered to Ashford House before noon. Then she sat at the grey window with her morning tea cooling beside her, and felt, for the first time in 9 months, the first tentative approach of something that might, if she allowed it, become hope. He replied within 2 hours. She had not expected that. She had told herself he would take at least a day, that she would have time to reconsider, to rebuild the wall she had spent the last half hour quietly dismantling. She had not had time. Clara set the tray down and withdrew. Josephine looked at the folded note with the feeling of someone who has leaned forward too far for the lean to still be theoretical. She picked it up. "Jay, you said, 'Those letters were mine, every word.' I have been sitting with those 5 words for the better part of an hour, and I find they have rearranged something in the way I think about the last 2 years. Not painfully. I want you to know that. The rearranging is not painful. It is clarifying. I have a question. You may decline to answer it. 2. The 23rd letter, the one about the oak tree in the north field of your childhood estate, the one you described as looking as though it had decided to simply refuse to die in an undignified way. Was that yours? The way you wrote about it had the quality of something seen, not imagined. Josephine set the note down. The oak tree. She had not thought about it in years. It stood at the far edge of her father's estate in Wiltshire. Ancient, architecturally stubborn, with 2 main branches that had grown at improbable horizontal angles, as though the tree had decided at some point to take up as much lateral space as possible in defiance of convention. She had sat beneath it every summer until she was 14, reading, watching the light come through the leaves. She picked up her pen. Yes, that was mine. The tree is in Wiltshire. It is still there, or was, as of 4 years ago, the last time I was able to visit. I used to believe that trees that old must have arrived at some form of indifference to weather. Now I think they simply learned over a very long time exactly where to put their weight. I have a question of my own you may also decline to answer. When did you suspect it was not Arabella? J. His reply came in 90 minutes. J. The 14th letter. You wrote about silence, specifically about the silence that falls in a room after a piece of music has ended and before the applause begins. You called it the most honest sound in any concert hall. I had been to a concert 2 days prior and had noticed that exact silence and thought about it in almost precisely those terms, and had said nothing to anyone because it seemed too inward, too specific to be useful in conversation. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself this for 8 more letters. Josephine read it twice. He had known from the 14th letter and kept writing for 17 more. She stood and went to the window. The grey morning had settled into a more committed greyness. A carriage passed below, its wheels loud on wet cobblestones. She watched it disappear around the corner, then came back to the desk. She thought about the 17 letters that followed his suspicion. He had kept writing, knowing, and kept writing. Had he been testing it, trying to resolve the inconsistency? Or had he simply continued the way you continue a conversation too valuable to interrupt with a question? She picked up the pen. I want to ask you something I have no right to ask. I am going to ask it anyway because I have had a year of being excessively careful, and I find rather suddenly that I am tired of it. What did you do when you suspected it was not her? J. This reply took nearly 3 hours. She had begun to think he would not answer, had started constructing methodically the reasons why silence would be the sensible response, when Clara appeared again. J. I wrote more carefully. I know that sounds insufficient. I am aware it sounds insufficient. But what I mean by it is this. When I suspected the person reading my letters was not who I expected, I became more precise, more deliberate. More myself, I suppose, in the way that you are more yourself when you believe you are truly being heard. I had not been heard, I think, before those letters. Not in that particular way. I did not want to stop being heard, simply because the listener might not be who I thought. I am not certain this reflects well on me. Josephine sat with the note for a long time. I did not want to stop being heard. She understood this with a specificity that was almost painful. She had kept writing for the same reason, because she was in those letters more fully herself than anywhere else in her life. The realness of it had become something she needed, the way you need a window in a small room. Just the knowledge that there is air available, even if you cannot always reach it. She had kept writing, so had he. Both of them for different reasons, from different vantage points of the same precipice, keeping the thing alive because they could not bring themselves to end something that had, without either of them fully understanding how, become necessary. She looked at the grey window. Then she picked up the pen and wrote the most honest thing she had written in 9 months. I stopped writing because I accepted Lord Pemberton's proposal, and I was not willing to keep writing to you and keep becoming more of myself in your letters while walking toward a life that required me to be less. It seemed dishonest. It seemed unkind to everyone involved, including you, though you did not know it. I want you to know that stopping was the hardest thing I did that year. I also want you to know that I am aware, with complete and unsentimental clarity, of the situation I am now in. I am not asking you for anything. I am not constructing a hope where there should not be one. I simply wanted someone to know that it was hard, that it mattered. You are the only person I can tell that to. J. She sealed it before she finished reading it back, sent it before she could change her mind. His reply came the next morning before she was downstairs. Clara brought it with the tea. Josephine sat up in bed, the grey London light coming through the curtains, and opened it. J. It mattered. I want you to hear that clearly, so I will not use any more words around it than are necessary. What you wrote in those letters, what you gave me across 2 years, it mattered. It altered something. I am not certain yet exactly what it altered, but I am old enough to know that alterations of that kind are not reversible. I am also aware of the situation. I am not asking you for anything that is not mine to ask for, but I would like, if you are willing, to continue writing to you. Not as we were, not under any pretense, simply as ourselves, as two people who have already told each other more than strangers generally do, and who might, with the appropriate care, find a way to be something that the available vocabulary does not quite adequately name. I am asking you to correspond with a friend. I recognize that this is not a simple request. Josephine read it once. She set it on the coverlet. She looked at the grey ceiling for 40 seconds. Then she wrote back, A. Yes. J. They wrote to each other every 3 days. Not an arrangement they had explicitly agreed upon. It established itself the way some things do when two people with similar rhythms enter a similar space, finding the cadence without having to negotiate it. 3 days between letters. Never fewer, which would have been too urgent. Never more, which would have begun to feel like withdrawal. October arrived, then November. Lord Pemberton was a considerate husband. He consulted her on household matters. He did not interfere with how she organized her days. He occupied his portion of her life with a decorum that was itself a kind of respect. He did not read her letters. She was grateful for this in a way she did not examine too closely. The letters changed shape through the autumn. In October they were careful, polite in the way of two people who have agreed to something and are still negotiating exactly what it is. He wrote about Ashford Park, which he had returned to for the shooting season, the cold of the north in autumn, the way the light left the landscape earlier each evening, the business of an estate with its own rhythms and obligations. She wrote about London, the strange intimacy of learning someone's house. Reading at the window while the rain made the street below look like a painting of itself. In November, they became less careful. She could not identify the specific letter in which the shift began, but somewhere in the November correspondence, she noticed she had written 3 pages about something she had read, and had not once concerned herself with whether the observation was appropriate. She had simply written it. And he had written back 4 pages building on her observation in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Somewhere around page 3, she laughed, quietly to herself, at something he had written about a parliamentary figure he found comprehensively exasperating, dry and sudden and gone again quickly. She had not noticed herself doing it until the laugh was over. She sat with the warmth of that moment for longer than was probably wise. They met twice in November, both times in public. Both times with the precise exhausting decorum the situation demanded. The first occasion, was a musicale at Lady Harrington's house in Portman Square. Josephine arrived with Lord Pemberton, took her seat in the third row, and it was only when the room had filled and the pianist had begun that she registered Gregory's presence, second row on the right in the midnight coat. He had not known she would be there. She could tell because she had learned across 2 years of correspondence the difference between Gregory's prepared composure and his assembled composure, the composure he wore when he expected to need it and the composure he built quickly when surprised. He assembled it now, sitting 4 feet to her diagonal. It was very good, but she noticed. His thumb pressed once against his ring finger. She turned her eyes to the pianist. They did not speak at the musicale. They did not speak at the interval. As the room rearranged itself into the social geometry of the refreshments hour, they managed, apparently by mutual instinct, to remain on opposite sides of it. Close enough that she was aware of exactly where he was. Far enough that there was nothing requiring acknowledgement. He left before the second half. The second occasion was a dinner at Lord Cavendish's house, at which both households had apparently been invited without the host being aware of the complications. Gregory was seated 4 places from her on the opposite side of the table, close enough for broader conversation during the middle courses, far enough that nothing intimate was possible. He spoke to his neighbours for most of the evening. She watched his profile when she was certain no one was watching hers. During the fish course, he said something to the woman beside him that made her laugh. Genuine laughter. Quick, brief. The thing he had said was, Josephine suspected, unexpectedly dry. He did that. The unexpected dryness, appearing without warning, disappearing before it could be fully appreciated. She looked down at her plate. She looked up and found him already looking at her from across 4 place settings and a candelabra. 3 seconds. Then the gentleman to her left spoke and she turned and the moment concluded. His letter came 2 days after the Cavendish dinner. J. Cavendish invited us both, apparently without malice aforethought. I want you to know, I did not engineer the situation. I also want to tell you something I was not able to say with 4 place settings between us. You have been writing to me for 2.5 years, in one form or another. And in all that time, the 31 letters and the letters since, you have never once written anything that was not, in the most fundamental sense, true. I know this partly because I have spent those years reading you closely enough to know the difference between what you say when you are being careful and what you say when you are not. And partly because I know it the way you know certain things, without evidence, without argument, simply as fact. I would like you to know that I have been, in return, trying to be equally true. I am not always good at it. I have had many years of practice at a different mode, but I am trying. There is something I am not saying yet. I think you know what it is. I am not saying it because the situation does not permit it and I am, where it matters, a man of some principle. But I wanted you to know it exists. The unsaid thing. That it is there. Josephine set the letter down. She sat in the quiet of the sitting room for a long time, the November light grey through the window, the small domestic sounds of the house around her, the sounds of a life that was decent and comfortable and entirely arranged around a choice she had made 9 months ago. A good choice, a reasonable choice. The choice of a woman who had believed she had nothing to wait for. She picked up the pen. I know what it is. I am going to ask you not to say it. Not yet. Not because I do not want to hear it. You know that I do, or if you do not, you should. But because I need to live in the space that exists before it is said for a little while longer. There is a difference between knowing something and hearing it. Once I hear it, the knowing changes shape. I am not ready for it to change shape. J. She sent it before evening. His reply came before noon the next day. 4 words. J. I will wait. A December arrived with the particular decisiveness of a season that has no interest in being tentative. The cold settled into the stone and brick of London's buildings and stayed. The days shortened. The city contracted inward. The social calendar offered its final flourishes. The Christmas assemblies, the year-end dinners, the rituals by which people of a certain class marked time and affirmed their continued relevance to one another. Josephine moved through all of it. She attended what she was required to attend. She wore the appropriate dresses. She said the appropriate things. She came home in the early dark of December evenings and sat at the writing desk by the window and read whatever Gregory had sent her that week. And then she wrote back. This was the part of December that felt real. Everything else felt like rehearsal. The letter that changed everything came on the 14th of December. It arrived in the morning with the rest of the post, on the same plain paper he always used. In the handwriting she would have recognized in a room full of documents. J. I'm going to Ashford Park for Christmas. My mother has arranged the usual gathering. Various cousins, a handful of neighbors, the general pleasant chaos she organizes with military precision and attributes to spontaneity. I find this year that I am approaching it differently than I usually do. I usually approach it as something to be endured with good grace. But this year I am going with the knowledge that I will not be writing to you for 10 days. Her household does not permit the kind of quiet I would need to write properly, and I find the prospect of 10 days without your letters rather more substantial an absence than I expected. This is not a complaint. It is an observation, offered without any design beyond honesty. Tell me something to carry with me. Josephine sat with it. Tell me something to carry with me. She thought of all the careful things, the appropriate things, the things that lived within the agreed-upon borders of their correspondence. She put down those things. She wrote instead. A. Here is something I have not told you. In the 27th letter, the one about the autumn light on the northern moors, where you wrote that there is a specific hour in late October when the light goes completely flat and gold and everything in it looks permanent, like a painting deciding to be real. I read that paragraph 4 times, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because it was so entirely right, and so entirely the way I think about light, that reading it felt like finding a sentence I had been trying to write for years, and discovering that someone had already written it, and done it better. That is what your letters have been to me, sentences I was trying to write. Take that with you. J. She sealed it and sent it without allowing herself to sit with it. His reply came the following morning, before he left for the north. J. Taken. The 10 days were longer than they should have been. She functioned. She attended. She was present at the Christmas gatherings Lord Pemberton arranged with his family's customary efficiency. She was fine. She simply noticed a particular quality of quiet that was different from the normal quiet. The place where his letters arrived was empty, not the silver tray. Other letters came, other correspondence. But the specific tray, the specific hour of the morning when she had come to know that there might be something from him that had a different texture now. On the 7th day she wrote to him, a note, brief and unadorned. Is Ashford Park as cold in December as you made it sound in October? J. His reply came 3 days later, written and sent from the north within hours of receiving hers. J. Colder. The kind of cold that arrives through stone walls regardless of the fires. My mother believes it builds character. I believe it builds wool expenditure. 3 more days. She read 3 more days and set the note down. She looked at the grey December window and felt, with complete and rather inconvenient clarity, that she was very much in love with a man she was not permitted to be in love with, and that this had been true for approximately 2.5 years, and that no amount of practical reasoning had changed it or was likely to. She had known this already, but knowing something is different from feeling it arrive in your chest like a complete sentence, without apology, fully formed. He returned to London on the 26th. His letter arrived on the 28th. J. I need to tell you something. I had a conversation at Ashford Park that I have been turning over since it happened, and I cannot write around it. My mother, who is perceptive in the particular way of women who have spent 40 years watching people and drawing correct conclusions from incomplete information, asked me on the 23rd who I had been writing to. I told her it was a new correspondence, a friend. She looked at me for rather longer than was strictly comfortable. Then she said, Gregory, you are not a man who uses the word friend without meaning something more precise. I did not reply. She said, I hope they know that you are not actually as cold as you appear. I said, I believe they might. She said nothing else. I am telling you this because I want to be accurate. The word I used was friend, and it is not a false word. But my mother, who knows me better than I usually permit, heard something in it that I did not correct. And I want you to know that I did not correct it. Josephine read it twice. Then she went and stood at the window with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass and looked at the January street below, The early carts, a woman walking with a basket, a dog investigating the base of a lamppost with great professional thoroughness. She came back to the desk. Your mother sounds formidable. She is also right about the cold. J. She picked up the pen again. I know that I am not permitted, under any honest accounting of the situation, to say the things that have been living in the margins of our correspondence. I know that we have both, with considerable discipline, maintained the distinction between what this is and what it is not. But I want to tell you one thing that falls perhaps just at the border of that distinction. I am better in the part of myself that most matters to me for having known you. Genuinely known you as not the Duke of Ashford. You, whatever this is, whatever the right word for it is, it has made me more myself, and I think that must count for something. J. She sent it. He replied the next morning. For the first time in their entire correspondence, he did not open with her initial. He simply wrote, You have made me more myself too. That is the truest thing I have said in 34 letters. I am going to go on saying true things to you for as long as you will let me. Arabella Whitmore came to call on the 9th of January. She arrived at 11 in the morning, dressed in pale gold, with the expression of a woman who has been rehearsing something and is not entirely confident in the rehearsal. Josephine received her in the sitting room with the precise warmth she had always maintained toward her cousin, genuinely fond and genuinely aware of the complicated architecture of what lay between them. She had never blamed Arabella. Arabella had not engineered any of what happened. She had simply been herself, which was careless and kind in equal measure and never quite sufficient. She had asked Josephine to write the letters with the breezy certainty of someone who does not register. They are asking for something significant. She had not known what she was setting in motion. Neither had Josephine. I've been meaning to come, Arabella said, settling into the chair across from Josephine with the slightly effortful grace of a woman sitting down to a conversation she has been avoiding. I kept postponing. I noticed, Josephine said, without sharpness. Arabella looked at her hands. She had, when she was uncomfortable, a habit of turning the pearl ring on her right finger. She was turning it now. I saw Lord Ashford at the Cavendish dinner, she said. Yes, Josephine said. I was there. He looked at you. Josephine was quiet for a moment. Did he? Not the way men look at women at dinners. Arabella met her eyes. The other way. The particular way. The fire crackled. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Arabella, Josephine said carefully, I am not reproaching you. Arabella's voice was quick, slightly unsteady. Whatever happened between the letters, whatever I have no right to reproach you for anything. You were doing me a kindness. What you did with it was... She stopped. I should have known you would make something real of it. You make everything real. It's both your greatest quality and the thing that makes you rather exhausting to be friends with. Despite herself, Josephine almost smiled. What I want to say, Arabella continued with the determined look of someone crossing a finish line through sheer will, is that I know. Whatever it is between you and the Duke, I know, and I am not an obstacle to it. Whatever you need me to say or not say or confirm, I am not an obstacle. Josephine looked at her cousin for a long moment. There is nothing to say, she said. I am married. Yes. Arabella's voice was quiet. I am aware that you are married. I am aware of how that happened and why. A pause. I have not been unaware of my part in any of it. The room was very still. What do you want, Bella? Josephine asked, gently, not harshly. Arabella set down her teacup, carefully. The porcelain barely made a sound. I want to not carry the thing I have been carrying since your wedding day, she said. When I watched you walk down that aisle and watched Lord Ashford's face when you did. What was his face? Josephine asked before she could prevent herself. Arabella looked at her steadily. Like a man who has just understood something too late, she said. The fire made its small sounds in the grate. It is not too late for everything, Josephine said finally, quietly to herself, as much as to Arabella. It is simply too late for some things. Arabella said nothing, but she reached across the small table between them and took Josephine's hand and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the January quiet, warm and civilized and entirely silent about the particular, complicated human geography it contained. After Arabella left, Josephine sat at the desk for a long time. She thought about the word obstacle and what it meant that Arabella had used it, about what it implied about what Arabella believed was possible. She thought about possibility. She had been living these 4 months in the correspondence, in the luminous private space of letters, of language, of the version of herself that existed only when she was writing to him. She had been careful to keep that space separate, careful not to let it contaminate the ordinary decent fabric of her days with a longing she could not act on. But longing, she was discovering, is not a manageable substance. It does not stay in the container you build for it. She picked up her pen. "Guys, my cousin came to see me today. She told me she was not an obstacle. I have been sitting with that word for the last hour. I want to ask you something that I have been not asking for 4 months, because the not asking was a way of maintaining a useful fiction. But I find I'm no longer interested in useful fictions, are you well? Not socially, not officially, in the way I have always meant when I have asked you things, the inside way. J." His reply came the following afternoon, and it was longer than his letters usually were. Not discursive, but thorough, in the way of a man who has decided to answer accurately. "J, I'm not entirely well. I have been functional. I have managed everything that requires management. The estate is in order, my obligations are met. I have attended what I needed to attend and said what I needed to say to all the people who require something from me. But there is a difference between functional and well, as you know better than anyone. And if you are asking the second question, I will answer it accurately. I am in a state I have not been in before, and for which I do not have adequate language. I know what I feel, I know it clearly, and I know that the situation does not permit me to act on it, and I have accepted that, because the alternatives are things I would not do. You are not a woman to be compromised or put in a position of difficulty, and I will not be the person who asks you to carry more than you already carry. But I want you to know something. In 30 years of living very carefully and keeping myself very contained, I have not once felt that the containment was costing me something I genuinely needed. Now I feel it. I am telling you this because you asked the inside question, not because I am asking you for anything." Josephine pressed her hand flat against the letter. She read it again. Then she did something she had not done in 4 months of correspondence. She wrote not a considered response, not a measured, carefully constructed thing, but simply what was true, without revision. I know. I know exactly what you mean. I feel it too. I have felt it since before I stopped writing the first time, since long before that, if I am honest, and I am trying very hard now to be honest. I'm going to tell you something I cannot unsay. I love you, not as a social fact, not as a declaration that demands anything from you or asks you to do anything with it. Simply as the most accurate thing I can say about my own interior state, which you asked me once to describe honestly. This is the honest description. I am not asking for anything. I am not constructing a hope from this. I am simply tired of the space that a true thing takes up when it is not said. I have been carrying the weight of it unsaid, and I am giving it to language now because language is what I have. You have always known how to receive what I give to language. J. She sat for a moment after sealing it. Her heart was beating with the particular speed of someone who has jumped from something high and is now simply in the air, waiting to understand what comes next. She gave it to Clara. Then she went to the window and stood in the cold January light and breathed and thought, whatever comes now. At least it was said. At least it exists somewhere outside my own chest. At least he will know. His reply arrived the next morning before she was downstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the grey London light and opened it. Jay, I have read your letter 6 times. I will not say the thing you said back to you. Not because it is untrue, but because I want to say it in person. Because I have been writing to you for 2.5 years, and there is a version of this that should not happen on paper. I know the situation. I know everything the situation is and contains. I am not asking you to do anything you have not already decided, but I am going to ask to see you, not at a dinner, not at a musicale, not in a room full of other people and crystal glasses and social geometry that requires us to stand on opposite walls. Somewhere quiet. Tell me when. She set the letter down on the coverlet. Outside, London was waking. The first carts, the early voices, the cold, clear light of a January morning that had decided for once to be honest about itself. She picked up her pen. Hyde Park, the East Path, near the old elm. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. J. She sent it. Then she sat very still for a long time, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, her eyes on the pale winter light at the window. She was about to step from the life she had been living into something she did not yet have a name for, and she was going anyway. Thursday arrived with frost, not heavy frost, the polite, restrained frost of a London January that coats the grass in white and then retreats by mid-morning as though embarrassed by the drama of it. It was there when Josephine dressed, present on the inside of the window glass in pale crystalline patterns. She stood before it for a moment before pulling on her gloves. Today. She had slept, which surprised her. Not deeply. She had surfaced several times through the night with the alertness of someone whose nervous system has received information it is still processing. But she had slept. She woke with the grey light and felt, beneath the anticipation and the fear and the entirely reasonable awareness of all the things this morning could not become, a quality of steadiness she had not expected. She told Lord Pemberton she was going to take the air in the park. He was at the breakfast table with his newspaper and his second cup of tea, and received this with the mild, warm approval of a man who considered fresh air fundamentally beneficial. She left the house at 9:30. Hyde Park in January had its own specific beauty. Not the lush, crowded beauty of summer, the fashionable parade of carriages and parasols, and the season's elaborate social theatre. The January park was stripped to its structure, bare branches against white sky, the frozen geometry of the paths, the particular stillness of a space designed for crowds when the crowds were elsewhere. Room to breathe, room to hear. Josephine walked the east path with her hands clasped in front of her, and her breath making small white clouds in the cold air. Her heart was conducting its own commentary on the situation, which she was largely ignoring. She reached the old elm at 10:03. It was a good elm, ancient and stubborn, holding its shape against winter with the confidence of something that has survived many winters and does not find them especially remarkable. Its bare branches made a dark pattern against the pale sky. A single bird sat in the uppermost fork, regarding the park with professional disinterest. She stopped at the base of it. She looked down the path. At 10:05, she felt the 5 minutes as acutely as she had ever felt time. She saw him. He was walking at his considered pace, not hurried, not dawdling. The walk of a man who has decided on a direction and is moving toward it with his full attention. He wore the midnight coat. Of course he wore the midnight coat. He saw her when he was perhaps 30 yards away. He did not change his pace. But something in his face changed. A settling, she thought, as though he had been holding something and had now put it down. He reached her. They stood 3 feet apart beside the elm in the cold January air and looked at each other for the first time without the obligation of social context around them. He was taller than she had registered at dinner tables and reception rooms, or perhaps it was simply that here there was nothing else to measure distance by, only the path and the frost-white grass and the bare branches overhead, and the two of them. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice, low and careful, with a quality of contained warmth she had always suspected from his letters and was now confirmed. "You ought to call me Josephine," she said, "after 2.5 years. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but adjacent to one. "Josephine," he said, just her name, no sentence around it. She felt it arrive the way things arrive when they have been a long time coming, not dramatically, not with the force of something new, but with the deep resonance of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being permitted to be heard. "You said you wanted to say something in person," she said. "I did?" A beat. The bird in the upper branches shifted. The frost on the grass caught the thin winter light and held it briefly before letting it go. "I have been in love with you," Gregory said, "since I have been trying to identify the exact letter, and I cannot. Somewhere in the 2nd year. There was a letter about a piece of music you heard from another room, a piece you couldn't quite identify, only catch fragments of through a wall, and you wrote that partial knowledge of beautiful things is its own particular cruelty." He paused. "I read that and thought, this person understands exactly the kind of thing I have never been able to say out loud, and I have not recovered from that thought." Josephine was still. The cold was present at her cheeks and the tips of her fingers. The elm was solid behind her. She was looking at the man who had written "I will wait" and then waited, who had read her handwriting on a letter addressed to no one and crossed a reception room to stand beside her, who had written 3 more days and then taken, and who was standing in front of her now saying the things she had asked him not to say until she was ready. She was ready. "I know the situation," he said, and his voice was steady, but she could hear beneath the steadiness the effort of a man maintaining something with both hands. "I know you are married. I am not asking you to do anything that honor does not permit. I am not asking you to break anything. I am simply standing here saying true things because you have always deserved true things from me, and I was not able to say this one through ink." She looked at him. She thought about the letter she had written on the night of her wedding. Dear no one in particular. She thought about the tree in Wiltshire. She thought about 31 letters and 9 months of silence, and the way he had pressed his thumb to his ring finger in the chapel. She thought about "You were known and I will wait," and the most honest person I have never met. She took one step forward, just one step, the step that halved the distance between them. Close enough now to see the grey of his eyes and the particular tension at the corner of his jaw, and the fact that his hands, at his sides, were very still in the deliberate way of hands that have been instructed to remain still. "I know the situation too," she said quietly. "I know all of it. I know what is possible and what is not. I know what I am asking and what I am not asking." She held his gaze. "I am asking," she said, "for you to not disappear." Something behind his eyes changed, the contained thing releasing carefully by degrees. His hands moved slightly at his sides, not reaching, just the small involuntary movement of something that has been held in check for a long time, acknowledging that the check has become very difficult. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She believed him. She believed him with the specific quality of trust that comes not from assurance but from knowledge, from 2.5 years of reading a person's interior architecture, of knowing how they think and what they hold, and how they treat the things they are given. She believed him because she knew him, genuinely and completely, in the way that almost no one is ever known. They stood in the frost-white morning in Hyde Park beside the old elm, 3 feet apart, maintaining everything the situation required them to maintain, and looked at each other with the full weight of 2.5 years and 34 letters and everything that had been said and not said and said eventually. Then Gregory reached out, slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered, and took her hand. Not her arm, the way he had in the garden passage between the hedgerows. Her hand, both of them still gloved. This was the park. This was January. There was nothing here that could not bear daylight. But her hand, held in his, with a firmness that was neither tentative nor demanding, but simply certain. She did not pull away. She curled her fingers around his and felt the warmth of it through the layers of wool and propriety and everything the world had arranged around them, and looked at the bare branches of the elm above and breathed. They stood like that for a long moment. The bird left its branch and crossed the white sky in a clean, undeviating line. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "If this is all it ever is," she said quietly. "If the situation does not change, if we are always only this, only letters and mornings in the park and the careful thing that is permitted, can you bear that?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his pulse through the glove, not imagined, actual, the faint, steady beat of it against her fingers. "Can you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the alternative. Not this, not the letters, not the mornings that would come after this one, not the voice on the other end of the language she had been building toward her whole life. She thought about the silence of 9 months, what it had cost her. "Yes," she said. "Then yes," he said. They walked the east path for 40 minutes, side by side, at the appropriate distance of acquaintances taking the morning air. They talked the way she had always imagined they would if they ever could. About a book he had read over Christmas, about a piece of music she heard at a recital in December that she could not stop thinking about the particular satisfaction of a good sentence and the particular frustration of an idea that refuses to become one. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have already said everything important, and what remains is simply the pleasure of the saying. At the end of the east path, where the iron gate opened onto the street, they stopped. He turned to face her. The morning had warmed slightly, the frost retreating as promised into the better-mannered version of January, Her cheeks were cold. His breath was white in the air between them. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. He released her hand with the same deliberateness with which he had taken it, slowly, without urgency, as though setting something down carefully rather than setting it aside. He held her gaze for one long moment. Then he inclined his head, the small, formal acknowledgement that the world could see if the world was watching, and turned and walked back into the park. She stood at the gate and watched him go. He did not look back. She had half expected it, had half hoped for it. But he walked with his characteristic evenness, his coat dark against the pale winter landscape, his figure growing smaller as the path lengthened between them, until he rounded the turn at the great lime trees, and was gone. She pressed her gloved hand, the right one, the one he had held, briefly against her chest. One moment more in the January cold, the city moving around her, the frost retreating, the long pale light of winter laying itself across everything without preference or prejudice, the way light does. Then she walked home. His letter arrived the following morning. It was short. "Jay, I have been trying to write a letter for the last 18 hours that adequately describes what yesterday was. I cannot. The language does not exist yet. I will write it eventually. I have time. Until Thursday." As she read it once. She sat at the writing desk with the morning light on the paper and the pen in her hand, and thought about language that does not exist yet, about time, about the particular quality of a life that contains, even at its edges, even in the careful, constrained form that the situation permitted, this, him, the voice she had been writing toward her whole life. She wrote back, I know. Until Thursday. J. She folded it, sealed it, set it on the tray. Then she sat at the window in the winter light and felt, under everything, beneath all the complicated and unresolved architecture of her life, the deep, steady warmth of being known, of being chosen, even at a cost, even within limits, even in the form of morning walks and careful letters and two gloved hands in the frost, of being loved in the truest and most lasting way, not despite who she was, but because of it. Because of 34 letters and an oak tree in Wiltshire, and the silence after music and the ink that had found its way from her hands to his, always hers, no matter whose name it had worn. She looked at the pale winter sky over London, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not performing anything at all.
I wrote you in the quiet, where no one knew my name.
In borrowed ink and borrowed light, afraid to stake a claim.
I sent you all my hidden thoughts in lines too carefully drawn.
You read the parts I never said and loved what I had worn.
I felt you in the spaces between what you would say.
In every pause and fragile truth you could not give away.
I kept your words like winter keeps the memory of sun, not knowing who was holding them, but knowing we were one. We built a world in paper walls where honesty could stay, and every truth we tried to hide found language anyway. Between the lines, between the years, between the silence and the tears, I found the place where you were real and learned what I was meant to feel. No vow, no storm,
No spoken name
could make this fire
less aflame.
come what may, come what might. I knew you in the quiet night.
I walked a path already set with careful steps and grace.
But every road I chose instead still led me to your face.
I never meant to cross the line or break what life had made.
I only wanted once to stand call it by its name. If all we are is written words in mornings in the cold, then let it be enough to know our story still was told. Between the lines, beyond the fear, beyond the things we cannot hear, we chose to see, we chose to stay, even when we walked away. No stolen breath,
No reckless vow,
just two hearts beating.
ain't honest now.
And if this love must live unseen, it lives.
And that is everything. In ink we met, in truth we stand, not by faith.